I remember the hallway first. How the lights above me flickered in a rhythm that didn't match anything human. Too steady, too cold. The kind of light that makes you feel exposed, even when you're alone. My shoes hit the polished floor harder than they should have, echoing like someone else's footsteps chasing me. And maybe it was just the lack of sleep, or the way fear can stretch time thin, but every reflection on that tile looked like a warning I was too late to understand. I ran anyway. Sometimes you run, because stopping would mean admitting the truth. St. Clair's was never quiet at night. Even on holidays, even during storms, the overnight shift hummed with a kind of weary life. Nurses trading tired jokes, gurneys rolling past half-closed doors, someone heating up leftover noodles in the staff lounge. But that night, the silence felt intentional, like someone had pressed a hand over the hospital's mouth. I slowed near the central station, expecting to see at least one of the night nurses charting. Their pens usually kept time like small metronomes. Instead, the desk was empty. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside an open chart, steam long gone. I touched the mug without meaning to. It was cold. That was when I noticed it, the faint hum of electricity, louder than usual, buzzing from somewhere deeper in the east wing. The air felt heavier there, like someone had been rushing, then stopped too quickly. I kept moving because Daniel had texted me only 20 minutes before. A simple message. I'm here already. Don't worry. But the worry came anyway, crawling up my spine, settling behind my ribs. The doors 2 or 3 were cracked open, just slightly, as though someone had slipped through them without wanting to disturb the air. And I felt something shift inside me, like I'd stepped into a story that wasn't mine. Not yet. That was when she appeared, the nurse. I didn't know her name. I'd seen her maybe twice in passing, a quiet woman with soft steps and tired eyes. She usually kept her head down, which made the way she moved toward me now feel wrong. Too sudden, too desperate. Her hand wrapped around my wrist before I even registered she was there. Cold fingers. Shaking. "Hide," she whispered. Her voice sounded like it had been borrowed from someone who'd stopped running just moments ago. I opened my mouth to ask why, but she shook her head before I could speak. Not a big shake, just a small, trembling motion, like even moving that much cost her something. Her eyes didn't meet mine. They hovered somewhere past my shoulder, toward or 3, like she couldn't bear to see what she was steering me away from. "You need to hide," she said again, breath catching on the last word. She didn't explain, didn't look back. She only lifted one arm, slowly, like lifting anything heavier might break her, and pointed toward the operating room doors. The gesture was small, but the meaning in it felt enormous. Then she stepped back, into the shadows where the lights didn't quite reach. And she stayed there, almost blending into the pale wall, barely breathing, as if she didn't want anyone to remember she existed at all. I should have listened to her, but my feet were already moving. There's a kind of fear that arrives quietly, like fog rolling across an empty field. This wasn't that kind. This fear came sharp, metallic, like inhaling too close to a broken light bulb. By the time I reached or 3, my hands were trembling so badly I had to hide them in the pockets of my coat just to feel functional. The doors parted with a soft hiss. The air that slipped out was cold. Too cold. Operating rooms were chilled. Yes, but this was different. The kind of cold that suggested someone had left in a hurry, forgetting to reset the temperature, forgetting to bring the warmth of human presence with them. I stood at the threshold, listening. No conversation. No beeping monitors. Just the steady hum of the ventilation system, a sound that should have been comforting but somehow wasn't. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, filling the silence. I thought of Daniel, somewhere inside this room, waiting. And I thought of the nurse's eyes, how she wouldn't let them rest on me for more than a second, as though she was already grieving something I hadn't seen yet. I stepped inside. The floor felt slippery beneath my shoes, though it wasn't wet. More like the air itself was shifting, unsure whether to hold me or push me away. Something deep in me, instinct or memory or fear, kept whispering turn back. But I didn't. Because sometimes you walk toward danger not out of courage, but because the alternative is not knowing. I took another step. Then another. Each one sounded louder than the last, as if the room was listening, taking note of my arrival. The lights above flickered. Once, then steadied, casting long, thin shadows that trembled across the operating table. I wasn't close enough yet to see who or what lay on it, but my breath caught anyway. Somewhere behind me, the nurse's warning echoed like a distant heartbeat.
Hide.
I swallowed hard and moved deeper into the room, one careful step at a time, feeling every part of me tense with something sharp and familiar, dread with a name I hadn't spoken yet. I didn't know what I would find, but the nurse's eyes, they told me she did. And that was the part that scared me most. The first thing that struck me was the light. Too white, too loud, in a way only light can be when it's trying to hide something. It pressed down from the ceiling, bleaching the walls, the floor, even the air itself until everything felt stripped bare. Like the room wanted me to see everything and nothing at all. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, letting the brightness settle into my eyes, letting the silence wrap around me. Then I stepped inside slowly because some rooms demand a kind of reverence. Or warning. I'd been in dozens of operating rooms before. They all smelled the same. Antiseptic, metallic, sharp at the edges. But this one, it carried something colder beneath it. Something faint, something like the aftertaste of fear. The overhead lamps hummed faintly, but not enough to explain why the room felt alive. Not warm, just awake. Watching. Waiting. And for a moment, I felt like I had walked into someone else's memory. One I wasn't supposed to see. My shoes tapped gently against the floor, and even that small sound seemed too loud in the emptiness. Where was the surgeon? The scrub nurse? Anyone? A room prepped for surgery isn't supposed to stay empty this long. There should have been voices, footsteps, the soft rustle of gowns, the quiet urgency of people who know exactly what they're doing. But here, there was only stillness. Rows of instruments had been set out with perfect precision. Scalpels, clamps, retractors, each aligned like someone had taken great care, then walked away mid-breath. Gloves lay folded beside an unopened pack of sutures. A bowl of saline sat untouched, reflecting the harsh ceiling lights in a trembling oval. It felt like the beginning of something, or the end. I wasn't sure which. Daniel was in the center of the room. I saw him only after my eyes adjusted to all that brightness. His body looked small on the table, thinner than I remembered, his hospital gown bunched awkwardly at the shoulder. He wasn't fully unconscious, at least I didn't think so. His eyelids fluttered now and then, not fully closed, not open either. Like he was stuck somewhere between dreaming and waking. Somewhere he didn't choose. Electrodes dotted his chest. Leads ran to a monitor beside him. One that should have been showing the rise and fall of his heart, something sharp and steady. But instead, the line barely moved. Not flat. Not beating. Just struggling. A thin, shivering line trying to become something recognizable. I moved closer, the coldness of the floor seeping through the soles of my shoes. It grounded me, in a strange way, reminded me that my body was still here, even if everything else felt unreal. His hand lay on the sterile sheet, palm up, fingers slightly curled. I reached for it without thinking. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. "Daniel," I whispered. His fingers didn't move. His breathing didn't change. Somewhere in the corner, a tiny green light blinked steadily on an unused machine, the only sign of life in a room full of silence. I felt a heaviness settle in my chest. A knowing. A warning. Something here was wrong.
So wrong.
I moved around the table, trying to steady my breathing, slow in, slow out. But the air felt thick, almost reluctant to enter my lungs. From this angle, I could see the 4-line trailing from his arm, the bag above it half full. No label, just clear fluid dripping at an unhurried pace. I brushed the back of my fingers against his cheek. His skin was cool, too cool for someone who should have been prepped only minutes before. And the machines surrounding him, they weren't doing anything. Most weren't even powered on. It didn't make sense. Surgery rooms aren't abandoned mid-prep. Patients aren't left unattended. Protocols don't just vanish. My heart pressed harder against my ribs, as if trying to warn me of something my mind hadn't caught up to yet. I stepped back, letting my gaze sweep the room again. The placement of the tools, the untouched supplies, the silence. It all came together like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Someone had prepared for a procedure. Someone had brought Daniel here. Someone had hooked him up. And then left him, left the room, left without finishing what they'd started, or without wanting to be here when someone like me walked in. The realization curled inside me like ice. A slow, quiet dread. One that whispered of intentions I didn't understand yet. What had he been scheduled for? And why did every part of this room feel like it was waiting for someone to notice the absence? I stood at the foot of the table, my hands trembling at my sides. The lights above buzzed softly, flickering once, twice, like a slow blink, as if the room itself was reconsidering whether to reveal whatever truth it held. Daniel's chest rose shallowly, then fell again, each breath quieter than the last. I watched his face, searching for some sign, some movement that told me he knew I was there. But he stayed suspended in that strange half-sleep, unreachable. The air filtration hummed overhead, the only steady rhythm in the room. And I felt, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that I wasn't just witnessing a medical oversight. I was witnessing an abandonment. And somewhere deep in the quiet, a question formed, one I wasn't ready for. What had he been brought here for, and why had everyone disappeared? There's a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty. It feels aware, like the walls are holding their breath, waiting to see what you'll do next. That was the silence in the room when I reached for Daniel's wrist. My fingers hovered for a moment, trembling, before they touched his skin. I braced myself for stillness, the kind that settles in and doesn't let go. But instead, something fluttered beneath my fingertips. A weak, staggering rhythm that didn't feel like sleep or sedation, just struggle. A pulse that whispered, very quietly, I'm not gone yet. I stayed there longer than I meant to, counting the uneven beats against the pads of my fingers. They came irregularly, like someone knocking from very far away, their hand slipping each time they tried to make contact. The room around me felt colder now, though nothing had changed. Same bright lights. Same untouched instruments. Same lingering hush. But I could feel something underneath all of it, a tension, a heaviness that didn't belong in a place meant for healing. I let go of Daniel's wrist and stepped back, rubbing my hands together as if I could shake off the chill. My gaze drifted to the foot of his bed, searching automatically for his chart, for some explanation, some ordinary reason for the strange rhythm of his pulse. But where his chart should have hung, there was only a blank clipboard. Empty. No vitals. No notes. No consent forms. Just a thin metal clip holding nothing at all. A missing chart isn't a small oversight. It's the kind of mistake that makes your stomach tighten, because charts don't simply disappear. They guide everything, every decision, every dosage, every second. Yet here Daniel lay, hooked to machines that barely blinked, with no record of who touched him last.
Or why?
I lifted the clipboard, feeling its lightness. It was too clean, not a single indentation where paper had once been pressed against it. As if it had been placed there on purpose, not as a placeholder but as a message. You're not meant to know anything yet. My breath came slower now, heavier, as I tried to steady myself. The scent of the room shifted when I inhaled deeper. Not the usual sterile sharpness, but something metallic, faintly sweet, threading through the air. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite name. Something familiar in a way I didn't want it to be. I moved around the table, studying every inch of Daniel's face. His eyelashes twitched now and then, but his expression stayed empty. No pain, no awareness, just a kind of suspended quiet, like someone had pressed pause on him. My hand brushed against the edge of the mattress, and the fabric felt unnaturally cool, like it hadn't been warmed by his body long enough, like he hadn't been here for as long as I'd assumed. Behind me, the air filter hummed again, a soft, steady exhale. The sound made me turn, my eyes scanning the corners of the room. The shadows weren't moving, but somehow, I kept feeling like they were supposed to be. I took a slow step backward, then another, letting the entire room come into view. Something inside me kept whispering that I wasn't alone. Not exactly. Not in the sense of another person standing there, but in the sense that the room itself held traces of someone who'd just left. The stool near the counter was slightly turned, not pushed in. The glove box sat open, a single glove half pulled out, like someone had meant to take it, but stopped last second. A pen lay uncapped beside the anesthesia cart. These weren't signs of a calm exit. They were signs of interruption, abandonment, or panic. I walked toward the counter, drawn to the faint shine of something on its edge. A droplet, barely visible. I touched it lightly with the tip of my finger. It wasn't water, and it wasn't saline. I wiped my hand quickly on my coat, a quiet dread crawling its way under my skin. When I turned back toward Daniel, the metallic sweetness in the air seemed stronger, more deliberate, like it was telling me a story through a smell instead of words. I swallowed hard. I couldn't explain why, but I suddenly knew, absolutely knew, that someone had left in a hurry. Someone who didn't want to be caught here. And whatever they were doing, it wasn't finished. I returned to Daniel's side, drawn by something deeper than fear. His chest rose in a soft, uneven arc, then fell again, each breath sounding almost borrowed. I rested a hand on the edge of the table, grounding myself against the cold metal frame. The room felt too bright now, almost blinding, as though the lights were trying to hide all the places where truth had seeped into the cracks. I leaned closer, listening to the faint, broken rhythm of his pulse. It sounded like a struggle, a plea. I glanced at the empty clipboard once more, feeling the weight of its silence. Why was there no record? Why had someone walked away mid-procedure? And what had they been trying to do before they ran? The questions hung in the air, soft, trembling, waiting for an answer I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The hallway lights flickered once, as if the building was clearing its throat. I remember the way the glow leaned into the doorway, pale and timid, before falling across the tiles like a tired shadow. That's when I saw her again. The nurse. The one who had warned me earlier, her voice barely more than a shiver. She stood there now with her hands folded into each other, fingers shaking in small, uneven breaths. Her uniform looked slept in. Her hair was pinned tight but sagged at the edges, like she'd been pulling on it without realizing. For a moment, we just stared at each other. The room around us didn't move. Only her eyes did, flicking past me, over my shoulder, toward places I couldn't see. I don't know why, but her presence made the operating room feel smaller, like the walls had taken one slow step inward when she arrived. Daniel lay behind me, still hooked to machines that didn't bother pretending to help. His breaths were shallow things, barely lifting the blanket. Every soft rise felt like a question he wasn't ready to answer. The nurse didn't step inside. She stayed halfway in the hallway, halfway out, as though crossing the threshold might trigger something neither of us could stop. When she finally spoke, the words came in pieces. You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Then her gaze darted to the ceiling, to the vents, to the empty corners where air moved even though nothing else did. I asked her what she meant, but her lips tightened around the explanation like it might splinter in her mouth. "I told you earlier," she said, voice frayed at the edges. "Things aren't what they look like." Her knuckles were white. She'd been holding onto something, fear, perhaps, long before she stepped into that doorway. She looked like someone carrying a secret that didn't belong to her. And she looked tired, not in the usual way, but in the way of someone who'd run out of places to hide. I stepped closer, careful not to make the room feel any louder than it already was. "What happened to his chart?" I asked her. "Why is it gone?" She swallowed. Her throat moved like she was pushing stones down it. "They switched files," she murmured. "Not just as others, too." The fluorescence hummed above us. A low, constant sound, too steady for what she was saying. "Who switched them?" I asked. But she only shook her head. Not a no, more like a refusal to touch a truth she feared would cling to her fingers. "A doctor came in earlier," she said softly. "He wasn't supposed to be here. Nobody knew he was on the schedule. And when I questioned the orders, her voice drifted off, pulled toward the hallway again. She stepped back without realizing. Her heel knocked against the doorframe. "I don't trust what they're doing," she whispered. "And I don't trust what they want with him." Something tightened in my chest. Not panic, not yet, but the beginning of it. A seed that didn't need sunlight to grow. "Why Daniel?" I asked. The nurse's breath hitched. For a heartbeat, she looked like she might tell me everything. Then her eyes widened, and she pressed a hand to her mouth.
"Please," she said.
"You have to take him out of here. Before they come back." Her words hung between us, heavy and unfinished. I felt myself go still, the way an animal does when it senses something in the brush that it can't see, but knows is there. "Who are they?" I asked quietly. "Tell me who." But she didn't. She couldn't. Her eyes kept searching the hallway, left, right, down toward the nurse's station where the phone sat silently, the cord swaying as if someone had let it go only seconds before. She stepped closer now, just an inch, just enough that I could smell the sharp disinfectant on her sleeves mixed with the faint, sour sweat of someone running on fear alone. "You're not listening," she said, voice cracking in the middle. "If you wait for answers, you won't leave at all." Something in me shifted, a slow realization, like a door unlocking not with a click, but with a sigh. This wasn't about confusion or overwork or mistakes in paperwork. This was something else entirely, something deliberate. Her hands trembled harder now. "I shouldn't have said anything," she whispered. "They watch the logs. They notice when someone stays too long in one place." Her gaze traveled up to the camera in the corner. A small red light flickered there, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. She lowered her voice. "I'm not supposed to be here." It was the first honest sentence she'd given me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The room held its breath with us. Daniel lay quiet behind me, the machines tracing a pattern that made no promises. The nurse took one final step back into the hallway. Her face softened, not with relief, but with resignation. Like she already knew she'd said too much, and that her life would be different now because of it. "Please," she whispered again, "don't let them take him." Then she vanished down the corridor, her footsteps fading before they reached the turn. I stood there, alone again, surrounded by the hum of machines and a fear that didn't have a name yet. But I could feel it, and it was closer than I thought. The wheels of Daniel's bed echoed softly, a hollow rhythm that followed us down the dim corridor. Emergency lights pulsed above us, faint, reddish glimmers, like the building had been breathing too shallowly for too long. I kept one hand on the rail, the metal cold against my palm. The other held the small flashlight the nurse had slipped me before disappearing. Its beam trembled with every step I took, painting the walls in shaky strokes. It felt like walking through a memory the hospital didn't want to keep. Every 20 feet, a light buzzed. Every 10, a shadow moved even though nothing else did. We were alone.
Two alone.
The hallway stretched ahead, long and skeletal, like an unfinished thought. Most of the bulbs had burned out, leaving only thin strips of red glow to guide us. I could barely see more than a few feet, but I kept moving, pushing Daniel's bed slowly so the wheels wouldn't squeal. He lay motionless beneath the thin blanket. His chest rose, barely. Fell, barely. But he was breathing, and that was enough to keep me steady. The nurse had told me to head east, though she hadn't said why. She whispered it like a confession, eyes darting toward the cameras as she backed away. Now I understood why she'd spoken so quietly. The closer we came to the east wing, the more the hospital changed. Signs were half peeled from the walls, like someone had scraped them off in a hurry, but not enough to hide what they'd once said. The paint near the corners bubbled from water damage no one had bothered fixing. Even the air smelled different, a mix of metal and stale cold, like a storage room left shut too long. The keypads on the doors were dead. Not broken, just silent. Unlit. As if the power had been choked off from this entire end of the building. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt erased. I kept glancing down at Daniel. His hair was damp with sweat, though the air was icy. I brushed it back. My hand lingered longer than it should have. "We're almost there," I whispered, though I didn't know where there was any more. The final door to the east wing stood tall and untouched. Its keypad was dark like the others, its surface smudged by fingers that hadn't managed to get through. My badge, the one I'd used countless times in every other part of the hospital, didn't even blink when I scanned it. No beep, no denial, nothing. I tried again, pressing harder this time. Still nothing. Frustration crawled up my spine. I reached for my phone to call the nurse, only to remember she had told me not to. Not here. Not near this wing. Then my hand brushed something in Daniel's chart sleeve, a thin, plastic card tucked where no one should have put it. His old admin badge. I stared at it for a long, silent moment. I'd seen his lanyard countless times at home, hanging near the door. But that badge, this one, I'd never seen. I held it up to the keypad. The tiny screen flickered, stuttered, then came alive with a weak blue glow. One beep, then another, and the lock clicked open with a softness that felt sinister. I froze, my hand still on the card. Why would Daniel have access to a place the staff pretended didn't exist? A place even the nurses avoided by instinct? He hadn't told me. He hadn't told anyone. The door eased open on its own, a gust of cold air pushing out as if the room inside had been waiting to exhale. I pushed Daniel's bed forward, and the lights inside flickered awake in a slow wave, one by one, illuminating everything they'd been hiding. The East Wing was quiet in a way that made sound feel unwelcome. No machines, no chatter, no footsteps behind closed doors. Just silence. Heavy, suspended, watching. The first room we passed had its door half open, the window fogged from the inside. When I stepped closer, the fog wasn't condensation, it was dust. Months, maybe years of it. Inside, the bed was overturned. Papers littered the floor, some yellowed at the edges, others crisp like they'd only fallen recently. A file cabinet stood open with drawers yanked out, as if someone had searched through them in a panic. Room after room looked the same, abandoned, untouched, yet disturbed. Someone had been here. Someone who shouldn't have. I bent down to pick up a folder near Daniel's bed. The label was smudged, but I could make out a few letters beneath the streaks. NIL 42. BM and my breath caught. The papers inside were blank. All of them. Blank charts. Blank test forms. Blank procedure sheets. This wasn't storage. This was erasure, deliberate and clean. I looked back at Daniel, my hand tightening on the rails of his bed. What did you know? What did they ask of you? What did they take? A soft creak stirred in the hallway behind me. I turned, slowly, carefully, but saw nothing. Still, the air shifted, the way it does when someone has just left or is just about to arrive. The wings stretched ahead, dim and hollow, swallowing the little light my flashlight offered. Dust swirled in the air like tiny, restless ghosts. I pushed Daniel deeper inside, each wheel turn echoing louder than the last. We passed another room, another overturned chair, another pile of empty charts that insisted they once held something worth hiding. The East Wing didn't feel forgotten. It felt emptied. On purpose. At the far end of the hall, another keypad glowed faintly, the only light that wasn't mine. I stood there, my hand still resting on Daniel's. His fingers twitched beneath mine, or maybe I only imagined it. Either way, I whispered to him, voice trembling in the cold. Whatever you were part of, we're going to find it. The hallway didn't answer, but the light ahead flickered, as if something on the other side had just begun to move. The first thing I noticed was the way the papers breathed when I opened the folder. A soft lift. A quiet fall, like the room exhaled with me. Dust rose from the floor in a thin swirl, catching the pale, overhead light. It drifted around my hands as though trying to warn me away. The folder lay heavy against my palms, heavier than simple paper should have been, heavier than truth ought to feel. I knelt there in the abandoned East Wing, Daniel's bed behind me, the cold air clinging to his still frame. And when I saw my name on that tab, printed cleanly, neatly, the world around me didn't just go quiet.
It paused.
I didn't open it right away. I just stared. My name looked out of place in that ruined hallway, like it had been misplaced from a life that made sense. The east wing had smelled of dust and sterilizer since we stepped inside, but suddenly the air felt sharper, tighter. I could taste metal at the back of my tongue, the way it tastes before a storm breaks open. Daniel lay a few feet behind me, his chest rising in slow, reluctant breaths. Every exhale seemed to whisper, "Keep going." Every inhale seemed to plead, "Don't." The pages scattered around us looked as though they'd been thrown in panic, but the folder in my hands, it was untouched. Crisp edges.
Clean type.
Filed deliberately. I slid my thumb under the flap and opened it. The first page was a medical scan. Not Daniel's.
Mine.
My eyes traced the date. 5 months earlier. Around the time I'd had that brief illness, the one that lasted only 2 days. Nothing serious. Just fatigue, a fever I blamed on overwork. Beneath the scan was a list of symptoms. Neurological disruptions, involuntary tremors, recurring migraines. None of them belonged to me. I flipped the page. Another scan. Another set of notes. Another evaluation sheet filled with tidy handwriting that insisted I'd suffered episodes I'd never experienced. I felt the cold through my knees where I knelt on the floor. But most of all, I felt the distance widening between the world I knew and whatever truth lived inside this folder. I kept reading, even as my hands trembled. The deeper I went, the more wrong the pages felt. Each note was clinical but strangely detached, as if someone had been documenting a stranger and then stamped my name on it afterward. Then I reached the consent form. My breath caught in my throat. My signature. Perfectly curved.
Perfectly placed.
Perfectly forged. The procedure names stretched across the page in bold, unfamiliar letters. Preventative Neurointervention, Tier C. My stomach tightened. I'd never heard of it. Never spoken to anyone about it. Yet the form described a meeting with a doctor I didn't know. It referenced a conversation about risks and benefits I had never had. At the bottom, a date. 3 weeks ago, at 2:41 p.m. 3 weeks ago, I was at home, on a video call with my sister, laughing about something small, something good, something real. I ran my fingers across the lines of my signature. The ink hadn't faded. Behind me, one of the ceiling lights buzzed, flickered, then glowed faintly stronger, as if reacting to the rise in my breath. I looked over at Daniel. His face was pale in the low light, slack with exhaustion or sedation. I still couldn't tell which. His eyelids twitched, but he didn't wake. Something twisted inside me, sharp and sudden. They hadn't planned something for him. They'd planned something for me. I read the last page twice before I could fully understand it. A schedule. A simple grid. Tidy columns. Neat handwriting again. My name filled one line, then another. Beside it, procedure scheduled. Clearance approved. The time slot listed was tonight. An hour ago, they had been preparing to bring me here. To this wing. To one of the rooms with the overturned chairs and empty charts. To one of the cold tables waiting in the dark. But Daniel had been the one wheeled in 2 or 3 instead. I felt the meaning slide into place with a weight that pushed the air from my lungs. The nurse. Her trembling hands. Her warning to hide. Her desperate plea to leave before they came back. She hadn't been afraid for Daniel. She'd been afraid for me. I looked around the abandoned rooms again, noticing things I hadn't seen the first time. Straps hanging from a bed frame, a monitor unplugged but still warm, footprints in dust that hadn't finished settling. Someone had left moments before we arrived. Someone who expected me here. Someone who thought I'd be unconscious, sedated, unable to question anything. A cold prickling crawled across my neck. My files, my forged consent, my scheduled procedure. Someone had built a story of illness around me, one page at a time. Someone who knew my signature well enough to duplicate it. Someone who had access to Daniel's badge. Someone who knew I'd eventually come searching for him. I closed the folder slowly, carefully. The hallway behind me creaked.
Soft.
Barely there, but enough to tell me we weren't alone anymore. Dust fluttered in the beam of my flashlight as I stood, folder pressed against my chest. Daniel lay still, unaware of the storm gathering around us. I slid the forged pages back inside, though my hands felt numb as paper. Somewhere down the hall, a soft click echoed, like a door unlocking or relocking. I couldn't tell. But the sound traveled straight through me. Whatever they had meant to do tonight, whatever lie they had woven into my medical record, it wasn't finished. I leaned over Daniel, brushing my thumb across the back of his hand. "We have to go," I whispered, more to myself than to him. But even as I said it, the hallway lights dimmed, one by one, as if someone at the far end of the wing had just flipped a switch and was walking toward us in the dark. The hallway lights flickered in a tired rhythm, the way old hospitals do when the night has worn them thin. I remember pressing my back to the cold metal frame of the doorway, holding my breath like it was something fragile. Somewhere down the corridor, a shoe scuffed the linoleum.
Slow.
Measured. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who never hurried because they already knew what they would find. And before I could think, before I could pray, I slid behind a surgical cart, its wheels whispering as it settled. That was the moment the room stopped breathing with me. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something sweeter, something I couldn't name. Daniel lay still on the bed, one arm bent awkwardly under the thin blanket, as if someone else had decided how a resting body should look. His heart monitor pulsed steady, but it felt too steady, like it was performing calm rather than living it. I kept one hand pressed to the floor to quiet my balance. Dust clung to my fingertips. The tile felt colder than it should have. Hospitals are supposed to feel clean, but this one felt emptied. Like everyone who worked here had learned how not to be seen. I listened to the soft electric hum of the machines, the faint rattling breath of the ventilation. Somewhere farther away, a cart rolled, a door clicked shut, and then silence settled back in like a blanket, tucking itself around every corner. I should have felt safe and quiet, but I didn't. Not then. Not after the nurse's face had drained of its color when she realized who I was. Not after she whispered, "You shouldn't be here," without ever explaining why. So I stayed hidden behind the surgical cart, my heart beating against the metal, waiting for footsteps that were already too close. The doctor stepped inside like he owned the dark. I couldn't see much from where I crouched, just the hem of his coat brushing against the floor and the soft flare of the overhead light against the top of his clipboard. He didn't even glance around the room, didn't check to see if anyone else was there. He simply began talking. His voice was level, almost warm, as if he were discussing the weather instead of whatever was happening to my husband.
Yes.
Daniel Walker. Non-compliant again, he said. A pause. A faint sigh. We expected resistance. That's not new. Non-compliant. The word thudded inside me like a dropped stone. He walked slowly toward the bed, his shoes gliding in that careful, unhurried way. His wife, yes. Unexpected arrival. It complicates things. My fingertips tightened against the tile. I felt its grit scrape under my nails. He stopped beside Daniel, the bed creaking just slightly under his weight as he leaned in. The rustle of paper. A clipped breath. From my hiding place, I saw only pieces of him, a sleeve, a hand, the edge of his badge swinging with each movement. But the name on it caught the dim light. Dr. Rowan. A name I'd heard in passing, spoken in half-whispers by staff who didn't think patients could hear. Something about his methods and things above their pay grade. He tapped Daniel's forebag gently, the way someone might test the ripeness of fruit. Everything about the gesture felt practiced. Too practiced. He pressed his thumb to a small valve on the foreline and adjusted it with an ease that made my stomach tighten.
Click.
A soft shift of fluid. A little too deliberate. "Let's proceed tomorrow morning," he said into the phone, his tone unchanged. No, she doesn't know. But we'll handle it.
Handle it.
The words slid under my skin like ice. He stood still for a moment after hanging up, as if listening to the machines breathe. Then he leaned closer to Daniel, his voice dropping to a low murmur. Not gentle, not cruel, just proprietary. "We could have avoided all this trouble, you know." Daniel didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even breathe differently. I felt a pressure building in my chest, the instinct to step out, to push him away, to break the silence that felt dangerously thick. But I stayed hidden, pinned in place by a fear that didn't feel like mine alone. Dr. Rowan straightened, the badge turning again, catching the light enough for me to read the rest of it. Medical director. Not a passing doctor. Not a resident doing rounds. The man in charge. He walked toward the door with that same steady rhythm. Not urgent. Not suspicious. As if everything in the room belonged to him, including the quiet. And just before he stepped out, he paused, letting his fingers drift across the doorframe, an unconscious gesture, like he was marking the space. Then he was gone. The footsteps faded slowly, each one landing heavier than the last. I stayed crouched behind the cart long after the hallway swallowed his steps. The machines kept humming, unaware of what they had witnessed. My legs trembled as I rose, the room tilting just slightly before settling back into place. Daniel lay exactly as he had before, still, pale, unreachable. I touched the 4-line he'd adjusted. The plastic was warm where his fingers had been. For the first time since stepping into that hospital, I felt something sharp beneath my fear, a question that cut clean through the haze. Why did he speak about my husband like a problem? And why did it feel like Daniel wasn't the only one they were planning something for? The lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come all the way back. The first sound wasn't his voice. It was the soft catch of his breath, thin, uneven, like someone trying to climb out of a dream they didn't want anymore. I sat beside him, my fingers resting on the side of his blanket, tracing the stitched edge just to feel something steady. The room held its usual shadows, stretched long across the floor by a single lamp that buzzed faintly overhead. Then his hand moved.
Barely.
A twitch against the sheets. I leaned forward, afraid even my breathing might scare the moment away. And slowly, like he was remembering how Daniel opened his eyes. There was a fog in them I hadn't seen before. A kind of unfocused searching, as if he wasn't sure whether I was real or something his mind had invented to comfort him. "Hey," I whispered. It felt like the only word that wouldn't break him. He blinked, heavy and slow. His gaze drifted past me at first, toward the ceiling tiles, the 4-line, the doorway where shadows pooled like water. Then finally his eyes settled on my face. I saw the desperation before I heard it. A flicker, a tightening at the corner of his mouth. The monitor beside him beeped in a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. Machines have a way of sounding calm even when the world is not. The hallway outside was quiet, too quiet for a hospital at that hour. As though someone had turned the volume down on everything that wasn't this room. "Daniel," I murmured, brushing his forehead with my fingertips. His skin felt cooler than it should have. He swallowed, the effort small but visible. There was something he wanted to say. Something heavy enough that even unconsciousness had tried to hold it down. And in that stillness, with the machines humming and the night pressing against the windows, I realized I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. But he spoke anyway. His lips parted, the words trembling before they found sound. "I didn't come here for treatment." The sentence floated out thinly, like it might dissolve before reaching me. I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "Daniel, what?" He shook his head very slightly, his breath snagging. "An audit," he whispered. "Internal, something wrong." I felt the floor shift beneath the weight of those words. He blinked hard, wincing as though the light had grown too bright. There were files, research, numbers that didn't make sense. His voice was a thread unraveling. "Patients hurt," he murmured. "Covered up, administration knew." The shadows around the room seemed to lean in. The quiet deepened, becoming something that listened. I touched his hand, cold, limp beneath mine. He didn't hold back, didn't squeeze, just let the contact steady him. He looked at me then, really looked, and something terrified flickered through his fogged eyes. "I found her name," he whispered. My breath caught. "My name? On what?" His eyelids fluttered. "List, wrong list, not safe." He tried to lift his hand, maybe to reach for me, maybe to warn me, but it only rose an inch before falling back to the sheets. He drew a shaky breath. "I came to stop them." I felt the words sink into me slowly, the way cold water moves through fabric, quiet but unstoppable. Stop who? I asked, barely managing the question. The room felt too small suddenly, too full of things I didn't understand. Daniel's eyes darted toward the door, though no one stood there. People involved, he murmured. Not just doctors. Not just, his breath hitched. Bigger. A tremor ran through him, subtle but unmistakable. I reached to steady him, but he wasn't slipping physically. It was something deeper. Something pulling him under. Daniel, look at me, I whispered, cupping his cheek. He managed to meet my eyes for a heartbeat. You weren't supposed to know, he said, voice fragile as dust. That's why another breath. Ragged. His pupils drifted. The fog thickened. I felt panic rise in my throat, sharp and metallic. Daniel, stay with me. What did you find? What did they do to you? His lips formed a shape, maybe a name, maybe a warning, but no sound came. His eyes closed slowly, like curtains drawn by tired hands. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm, unmoved, unaffected. But Daniel was gone again, sinking back into whatever darkness had been holding him. I sat there with my hand on his cheek, feeling the warmth fade. And in the echo of his unfinished sentence, one truth settled like dust on untouched shelves. Someone hadn't just heard him. Someone had wanted him silent. I stayed beside him long after his breathing evened out, long after any hope of him waking again had slipped away. The lamp above us hummed softly, casting pale circles on the floor that trembled with every flicker of the bulb. Outside, the hallway remained empty, its silence unnerving in its perfection. I looked at his hand resting on the blanket. Still, helpless. And I thought about the list, the files. My name written somewhere it didn't belong. The machines blinked calmly beside him, as if they hadn't heard what he said. As if nothing in this room had changed. But everything had. I brushed a stray hair from his forehead, my fingers trembling just once. Just enough to admit the truth. Someone had tried to keep him quiet. And if he'd truly come here to protect me, then whatever he found was already reaching for both of us. The first alarm didn't sound like danger. Not at first. It was soft, almost questioning, drifting faintly through the corridor like a child calling from another room. But then another joined it. And another. Soon the whole wing seemed to vibrate with a low, pulsing cry. I stood there with my hands on Daniel's bed rail, feeling the metal tremble under my palms. Every light overhead flickered in a slow, uncertain rhythm, like they were afraid to stay on too long. For a moment, I just listened to the alarms, to the hum of the vents, to my own pulse stuttering in my ears. And then I started to push. The wheels groaned as I steered him down the narrow back corridor, the rubber dragging against flooring that hadn't seen real use in years. Something about that hallway felt forgotten, like even the hospital didn't want to remember it existed. Daniel lay motionless beneath the thin blanket, his breathing shallow, his face washed in the sickly glow of the emergency bulbs. I kept glancing at him, as if he might wake up suddenly and tell me what to do. But he didn't move at all. The alarms in the distance kept shifting pitch, soft to sharp, sharp to frantic, like they were searching for the reason they'd been triggered. Like they hadn't found us yet, but they would. My hands shook on the rails, and the wheels rattled whenever I pushed too fast. I forced myself to slow down, to breathe. At the end of the hall stood a service door, unmarked, the kind of door most people walked past without seeing. Its square window was black, the glass reflecting only the faint light behind me. For a second, I hesitated. Leaving through a service exit didn't feel right, didn't feel safe. But neither did staying. A gust of cold air seeped through the bottom of the door, carrying the smell of rain and something metallic. I pressed my shoulder to it, eased it open, and the night exhaled into the hall. The loading bay was unlit, as if the storm had swallowed every bulb. I maneuvered Daniel's bed over the threshold, the wheels bumping hard against the concrete lip. Outside, the rain fell in thin, steady sheets. Not a downpour, just enough to turn every surface slick, reflective, dangerous. The pavement shone like dark glass, catching the low glow of distant streetlights and stretching them into blurred ribbons of color. Somewhere blocks away, A siren wailed and dissolved into the rain. I tightened my grip on the bed, pushing him farther from the doorway, farther from the wind that kept slapping against my back. Each step felt heavier than the last. Shadows gathered behind dumpsters, beneath the overhang, along the far wall where the light couldn't reach. Every one of them seemed to watch us, or wait for us. I whispered Daniel's name, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. It made the silence smaller somehow. My shoes slipped on the wet ground, and for a moment the bed veered, skidding slightly. I braced my body against it, breath catching. "Come on," I murmured under my breath, to him or to myself. "Just come on." A gust of wind pushed the rain sideways, stinging my face. Behind me, the service door swung shut with a hollow clang. And just like that, we were outside the hospital. But not safe. Not even close. The alarms were louder now. Not just one wing. The whole building seemed to be waking up. I couldn't tell if the sound was growing closer, or if the night was simply carrying it differently. Either way, it made my heart stutter. I angled Daniel's bed toward the far end of the loading bay, where a narrow ramp led down to an access road. The wheels hit rough pavement, splashing through shallow puddles. Rain collected on Daniel's blanket, soaking the thin fabric until it clung to him. I brushed water from his cheek, my fingers trembling. "Stay with me," I whispered. Though he wasn't conscious, the words felt necessary, like if I stopped saying them, I might stop believing he was still here. Another alarm blared from inside the hospital, sharper this time. Urgent. I froze. Someone shouted in the distance. A voice I couldn't make out, carried and torn by the rain. They discovered something. Maybe his empty bed. Maybe the missing files. Maybe both. My pulse pounded against my ribs, desperate and uneven. I pushed harder, forcing the bed down the ramp, my shoes slipping with every step. The night felt too open now, too wide, like it could swallow us whole. The hospital loomed behind us, tall and dark except for those red emergency lights flashing through the windows. It didn't look like a place of healing anymore. It looked like something that was waking up to chase us. At the bottom of the ramp, I paused, chest heaving. Rain misted across Daniel's face, running down his jaw in thin, trembling lines. I wiped them away, though more kept falling. He didn't stir. The alarms echoed through the night, bouncing off the empty parking lot, off the walls, off the wet ground beneath my feet. A restless animal crying out in the dark. I looked back at the hospital, its windows glowing faintly, its doors sealed, its silence suddenly unnatural. Someone inside would notice. Any second now. I wrapped both hands around the rails of the bed, grounding myself in the cold metal. "We're leaving," I whispered, more promise than statement. My breath fogged in the air, and as I pushed him toward the road, into the rain, into the uncertainty, into anything that wasn't that building, I realized something simple and terrifying. We had no place to run, but staying would mean being found. Rain splashed against the asphalt in thin, constant lines, turning the loading bay into a muted mirror of distant lights and shadows. I crouched behind a supply truck, its metal chilled through my thin jacket, every corner a hiding place and a trap at once. The wind carried the faint smell of antiseptic from the hospital behind me, mingling with wet concrete and gasoline from a far-off generator. I pulled Daniel's tablet from beneath the blanket, its cracked screen catching the dim glow of an overhead bulb. Even broken, it hummed alive in my hands. A pulse of life in a night that felt determined to swallow us whole. I tapped the screen, and the evidence started to appear. The world narrowed to the rectangle of light in my palms. The rest of the loading bay disappeared, rain blurring the edges, shadows pooling like ink. Daniel's tablet was scratched and cracked, but the files he'd saved remained pristine. Internal memos, video clips, surveillance footage. Every corner of the hospital we'd just escaped from now laid bare in pixelated clarity. My fingers trembled as I swiped through them, afraid to touch too hard, afraid that doing so might shatter both the screen and my fragile sense of reality. One clip showed the doctor adjusting 4 lines while speaking in hushed tones to someone over the phone. Another caught an administrator slipping consent forms into a stack, their handwriting eerily familiar, forged signatures glowing like warnings under the fluorescent lights. The worst was a clip of me entering the hospital weeks ago, though I had never been there. The hallway, the badge swipe, even my hesitant step toward the front desk, all fabricated. It was a video designed to justify a procedure I never consented to. My stomach clenched. Every breath felt heavier. Every raindrop against my jacket like a reminder that we had crossed into something deeper than fear. Daniel had risked everything to save me, and now I understood why. I paused on a clip of the staff switching patient files, hands passing folders like silent accomplices in a shadowed ritual. The camera angle, hidden unblinking, showed every detail. Charts being swapped, signatures forged, a consent form pressed into a folder marked with my name. My fingers hovered over the screen. I wanted to look away. I wanted to pretend it wasn't true. But every file, every clip, was proof. I scrolled further, finding memos addressed to security and administration, detailing patients flagged as non-compliant or at risk. My name appeared again, this time on paper as well as video. The sound of my own heartbeat rose over the tapping of rain. I imagined Daniel, somewhere in a hidden corner of that hospital, risking exposure for every moment he had captured. The last clip made me gasp quietly. It showed the very day I'd first questioned my appointment. I appeared to sign forms, talk to staff, enter rooms. All of it false. All designed to make me look like I'd agreed to something I never knew existed. I leaned against the cold truck, trying to process it. Had Daniel known? Had he understood that I was next? The tablet vibrated in my hand as a new file loaded, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The final clips were surveillance from the ER wing. The camera angles showed staff moving with precision, as if rehearsed, whispering into phones, glancing over shoulders, swapping files, and crossing out names. They didn't know the camera would capture them, but Daniel had. He had seen it all. I watched a nurse hesitate over a clipboard, glance at a monitor, then nod to the administrator, approval sealed with a flick of the pen. It all unfolded slowly, methodically, like a dance where every step was meant to deceive. And then I saw it, a folder labeled with my full name, placed on a gurney, waiting. For me. I pressed my hand to my mouth. My stomach knotted tighter than it had all night. Daniel's foresight, his careful documentation, his quiet bravery. It wasn't just to uncover the truth. It was to save me. Rain leaked through the cracks of the truck roof, tapping on my sleeve. I could feel the world pressing in. The dark, the cold, the hospital looming behind us, the night threatening to swallow every secret. I realized then that Daniel's tablet was more than evidence.
It was a lifeline.
Proof that someone somewhere had planned something I could not yet fully understand. And that realization hit harder than any fear I had felt in the hospital corridors. I closed the last video with a trembling thumb, the screen going black, but leaving the images etched in my mind. Daniel's tablet hummed softly, almost as if it were still alive, still aware, still protective. The rain fell heavier now, masking the sounds of the hospital behind us. A distant siren moaned through the night, but here, behind the truck, the world seemed paused, suspended in a fragile silence. I pressed the tablet to my chest, letting its faint warmth remind me that Daniel had thought of me, that he had seen what they were planning, that he had tried to warn me. Somewhere in the dark, the hospital waited. The staff, the administrators, the doctor, they didn't know we had the proof. But I did. And as I pushed the bed slightly forward, slipping further into the shadows of the night, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Daniel had risked everything because he realized I was next. And now, so had I. Dawn rose quietly, like someone lifting a curtain without wanting to wake the room. The sky wasn't bright yet, just a pale wash of blue behind the trees, soft enough to feel like a held breath. I stood at the edge of the empty field behind the service road, the grass still slick from the night's rain. Daniel lay a few feet behind me, half covered by the blanket I'd pulled from the truck, his breathing thin but steady. The tablet sat in my hands, cold and too light for what it carried. Truth should weigh more than this, I thought. But morning has a way of making even the heaviest things look small. The wind brushed across the grass in gentle sweeps, bending each blade like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. Somewhere in the distance, an ambulance wailed, a long, tired cry that bled into the early light. It made the air feel thinner, like time itself had started moving faster while I wasn't paying attention. I knelt beside Daniel. His face was paler than it had been hours before, but his jaw was relaxed, the tension gone from around his eyes. He looked almost peaceful, as if the night hadn't tried to erase us. I touched his shoulder lightly. He stirred but didn't wake, not fully. That was the thing about exhaustion. It pulled you under in the quiet ways danger never did. The tablet glowed faintly against my palms, its cracked screen catching the first trace of daylight. Inside it lived the truth, raw, undeniable, and dangerous enough to burn everything it touched. Evidence that could break lives open. Evidence that could save others. But the truth never comes without a cost. To take it to the authorities meant stepping into a system built tall enough to blot out the sun. A place where people went to disappear. To run meant preserving the only life I could still protect. His.
Mine. Ours.
But running meant silence. And silence meant letting the sickness grow behind those walls. I closed my eyes. Neither choice felt like surviving. The wind shifted, carrying the metallic bite of the hospital's air vents even from this far out. A reminder of how close danger still sat. How little space there was between the past and the present. I turned the tablet over, the cracked glass catching the light like a wound. Its files remained open where I'd left them. Memos full of coded language, videos that should never have existed, the fabricated recording of me walking down a hallway I'd never stepped foot in. Watching myself on that screen had felt like witnessing a stranger wearing my skin. The clip flickered once, freezing on the moment. I turned my head toward the camera. Even knowing it wasn't real, I felt something hollow inside me shift.
Fear, maybe.
Recognition, maybe not. Daniel murmured something faint behind me. Just a breath, barely a shape of a word. I turned, watching the way his fingers curled slightly against the blanket, like he was reaching for something he'd forgotten he needed. I remembered how he'd looked earlier. Eyes sharpened by urgency, hands steady despite the chaos. Daniel had always been quiet, almost forgettable in hallways full of louder people. But he had seen everything, recorded everything, risked everything. Because he knew what the hospital had planned. Because he knew I was next. The ambulance's hum grew louder for a moment before fading again, swallowed by distance. Time was slipping. And choices, once clear in theory, blurred in the gray light of morning. I walked a few steps away from him, needing air wide enough to match the weight in my chest. The field stretched out before me, long and empty, the horizon glowing softly like it had something to teach me if I just kept staring. I thought of the authorities, their desks lined with reports, their eyes trained to look past people like me. If I walked in with this tablet, would they listen? Would they believe? Or would they bury it the same way the hospital had buried so many others? I imagined the questions, the waiting rooms, the quiet dismissal behind polite smiles. The way systems protected themselves first. Always first. The other path rose beside it like a shadow. Daniel waking, breath shallow but warm, looking at me with that silent trust he'd never once asked me to earn. The two of us leaving before the hospital realized what he'd taken. Starting over somewhere far enough that the truth couldn't follow. But starting over meant carrying that truth like a stone in my pocket. Every day, every night, knowing that others might be walking into those same hallways with no one to warn them. I pressed my palm hard against my forehead. The sky brightened another shade. The world kept moving whether I chose or not. Behind me, Daniel let out a soft exhale, like he sensed the moment tightening around us. I turned, meeting the faint rise and fall of his chest. And suddenly, the decision didn't feel like two paths. It felt like one long road with different kinds of losses waiting ahead. I sat beside him again, lowering myself into the damp grass. The morning light touched the side of his face gently, as if asking him to wake, but he stayed still, breathing slow and fragile. I held the tablet against my knees. The screen dimmed, reflecting only the blurred shapes of the sky and my own tired eyes. The ambulance hum drifted once more across the distance, faint, fading, but enough to remind me that the world wasn't pausing for us. Not anymore. I brushed a strand of hair from Daniel's forehead. He didn't stir, but his breath warmed my hand in the smallest way. The choice pressed against my ribs, patient and heavy. Which path would keep us safe? Which path would I regret for the rest of my life? The morning waited for my answer. And somewhere behind that rising sun, the future waited too.